Hello, and welcome to the DME podcast, brought to you by DME, the podcast booking platform. Whether you're a podcaster or an aspiring guest, the DME app is a perfect platform for you to get booked and manage your podcast bookings. I'm your host, Sikh, the founder of DME, and on this podcast, we'll be discussing the latest news and views in tech, the ins and outs of entrepreneurship, and even dipping our toes into the adrenaline-filled world of mixed martial arts. On this week's episode, I welcome Dr. James D. Holt. James is an Associate Professor of Religion at the University of Chester, who has written numerous books covering the Christian, Hindu, Buddhist and Sikh faiths. In this episode, we cover some of the issues with the teaching of religion and how James aims to address these gaps with his own writings, the basics of religion, what role it plays in human evolution and the human psyche today. We also discuss James's fascination in studying the Dharmic faiths, how they differ from Abrahamic religions and the future of religion in Western societies. James also has a strong Instagram and TikTok presence, where he delves deeper into specific questions on all faiths, so please check out his channels at James D. Holt. I really enjoyed speaking with Dr. Holt. This is a conversation that could have run for hours, but we condensed it down to 40 minutes. So please enjoy Dr. James D. Holt. Dr. James Holt, welcome to the DME podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Thank you for coming on and agreeing to do this. I know it's probably not the best of times in terms of being in the holiday period, but hey, we all need a break from the family sometimes, don't
we? We do, yes.
So could you just give us a bit of a background into your own study and your own fields of work? Because I found it quite fascinating. I'm sure our audience will as well.
Yes, so currently I'm Associate Professor of Religious Education at the University of Chester, but that's after almost 30 years of my career. So I started off as a religious education teacher in secondary schools, and I did that for about 15 years here in Manchester. And then alongside that, I did some other studies. So I did a couple of master's degrees and was in the middle of my PhD actually when I moved to Chester. And the reason I moved to Chester was RE, or religious education, is taught very well in schools and I think is incredibly important. But sometimes I think people question its value or don't understand its value. And so I thought, probably quite conceitedly, that I could maybe have an impact on the way that it's taught and what happens within it. And so I made that transition, and my main role is training teachers both at the primary and the secondary school level here in England. And at the same time, I guess I completed my PhD, which looked at how the benefits of interfaith engagement and what we can learn from different religions and different things like that. That was a very brief summary. And then over the last few years, I've started writing a lot. One of my books is about, well, how we teach RE, but the others are subject knowledge-based books as well. So I've done one on Sikhism, Buddhism, Hinduism. I'm currently working to a deadline for Judaism. And so it's kind of, I just have such a great interest in religion, and that's kind of how I spend my life, is writing, reading and teaching and experiencing, I guess, religion as I work with people and as I talk with people as well.
Yeah. When it comes to religion and how many thousands of years, I think you're not short of source material, are you?
Absolutely. No, it's strange because my students often come to me and say, I want to know everything and I want to be able to be fully prepared to teach. And it's like, do you know what? I've been studying religion for over 30 years of my adult life, and I learn new stuff every day. And I do a TikTok, and every time I post something, I think it's not fairly uncontroversial, but I think, okay, I've got this. And then obviously people from that religious tradition will say, and it's generally accurate. I don't mean generally accurate. It is accurate. But then there's obviously people within religious traditions who have a slightly different understanding to others as well. And it's like, there's no way you can understand the diversity and the messiness completely. You just have to sit back and think, yep, this is my current understanding, but I'm open to learning stuff that I don't already know. There's, as you say, thousands of years and also thousands of different understandings, even within one religion.
Yeah. So what first attracted you to kind of teaching or studying and teaching religions? What was was it from a young age where you kind of religious yourself, or?
So it's interesting. So Obviously in England, we have religious education each week. It's a lesson within school. And you know, I hated it. Couldn't stand it. Didn't see the point in it. And then when I was 14, we moved house. This is a very weird origin story. We moved house, which meant I moved school. And in so doing, I wasn't able to do economics as a GCSE. So they gave me a choice of either geography or RE. And I hated RE just a little bit less than I hated geography. Apologies to anyone who loves geography. I do now, but at the time I really detested it. So I that's how I got into RE. But my teacher, a guy called Edward Banks, was just amazing. He kind of helped me see the relevance of it and helped me understand. And about the same time, I also became religious. I'm not sure. I think I would have liked religious education as it was without being religious. But it just kind of worked in tandem. And then I couldn't decide when I went to university whether to do history or religion. So I did both. I was fortunate enough to go to a university that enabled me to have a kind of dual combined honours. And then when I started teaching, I trained as both a history and an RE teacher. And religion, I got married and moved to Manchester. And just the diversity, the experiences that I was having, the teaching that I was doing, I just fell in love all over again, really, with religion and the teaching and studying of religion. It's as you say, there's so much to learn. And then the real world impact that it has on people. So one of the problems I find with sometimes the way we teach religion or talk about religion is that it's a historical event, that we look at what happened in the past. And that is important. But what's most important is that religion and belief is a lived reality for people today. And so, yes, that's made sense of by what's happened in the past. So for a Christian, understanding the life of Jesus and is incredibly important. But actually, I want to understand how my friend Sukhbir lives his life and what it is about religion that makes his life different. And so I explore Sikhi to try and understand him. And so that's a very long introduction, so I do apologize, of kind of why I love religious studies so much. It was an accident at the beginning, and then just kind of a slow falling in love, and then consumes my life. I'm in my office at the moment, and just about every bookshelf, I have one history bookshelf, but everything else is just religion from corner to corner. So yeah, I'm obsessive.
That's a good way to be. But I know it's similar with history. I'm a bit of a history buff as well. And yeah, there's so much to learn. It's untrue, and so many different takes or perspectives on history, and the same historical events can be viewed completely opposite by different people. Kind of leads me on to the next question, really, kind of a wider meta-based question, is kind of what role does religion play in kind of the human evolution over the last few thousand years? What came first? Did people come first, or did the religious aspects of it come first? Probably deep theological questions, but what's your perspective?
I was going to say it depends really on your view of things. So from sociological, anthropological perspective, you would look at it and you would say, okay, so humanity or humans looked around themselves and wanted to find answers to questions, whatever that. Why does the sun rise in the morning? Why is this happening? But from a religious perspective, and it will vary from religion to religion, it's kind of the question as well. In fact, I've just been writing about this in Judaism, is God or the Almighty, whatever name the divine is given, kind of existed and then decided to create. And so almost it's innate within us to have this longing for a religion. We are born, if you like, with this knowledge of God. And so there's different views, but in some ways we can almost separate the two. And that sounds terrible because I think it's wrong to separate sometimes. But when we look at stuff, it's religion serves that purpose, and it serves a number of purposes over the years. It is, of course, providing answers to questions, and different people have different answers to various questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? And so on. But it also, I think there is a need within humanity to be in community or have relationships. And so religion can also serve that function. Now, for a religious believer, then for most people, religion is inspired and it is structured in a way that supports, that strengthens, that draws people closer together, also to God, if there is a concept of God. For others, such as Karl Marx, it does serve that purpose. It does bring people together and it does provide answers, but in a negative way. It helps, for example, Marx would say, those at the bottom of society remain happy with their lot in life and keeps those in power and kind of there. So people would in the past have Volt at kind of reacting against the king or rebelling against the king because he was placed there by God. And so it kind of kept those structures in places. We see that around the world in, for example, the Indian caste system. Critics would say, well, no, it's not inspired at all. It's a societal construct that keeps those at the top in power. So it depends on your perspective as to whether religion is a positive or a negative force. But I think overwhelmingly, from my perspective, religion has been mainly positive over the years in the sense that it gives people identity and it helps people make sense of life. Obviously, religion has been used negatively. It's impossible to look at the world and look at history without seeing religion having been used as an excuse for the worst atrocities. But I think for most people just living their lives, it is something that kind of gives them a sense of community and also provides answers, if you like.
Yeah, so that's kind of been my perspective over the years of kind of podcast consumption and kind of listening to the debates of the atheists versus the theists. And the atheists always seem to think, take the position of whether it's true or not, whether Christ did was resurrected after 3 days, or whether Muhammad did ascend to the heavens on a winged horse, or whatever it may be. But I've always got the opposite position as well. Doesn't matter whether it's actually true or not. Is that people believe it's true and they act accordingly. So that's maybe the positive aspects. Obviously, you can use religion and justify anything you want to do using religious context. But that debate is always fascinating me, and I think people always talk past each other in that aspect. You're trying to debate whether something's true or not. So it doesn't matter whether it's true, whether it physically happened. Maybe it's a question, right? If someone believes it happens, how do they act? And maybe that's the thread throughout human evolution, is that if they believe it's true, then they behave better during the course of their lives. So maybe that's the impact of it. So I'm not quite sure, but I'll take your more learned experience or viewpoint on that.
It is interesting because, yeah, I mean, the truthfulness of something is a matter of personal belief and faith. So, as you say, people will talk past one another, and it's very rare that someone who is trying to convince somebody else that what they believe is false, because it's not. In some ways, religion isn't necessarily verifiable. You can't prove the origins of the universe, although non-religious people might say, well, yes, we can prove the Big Bang. And it's like, well, yeah, you might be able to show the how, but not necessarily the why or who or whatever else. So I think you're quite right, is sometimes when the veracity of something that is being said. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some things that are patently false. And patently true. So, for example, we know there was a man, if we use Christianity as an example, called Jesus, who lived and was crucified. There's kind of sources for that. Whether he was the Son of God, as Christians believe, whether he was a prophet, as Muslims believe, yeah, that's a matter of faith.
Yes.
And yeah, as you say, when we study, when we learn, when we try and understand other people, it's about trying to think, well, this is what someone believes. How does it affect their lives? And that's the most important thing when we're communicating. Because generally speaking, when we have civil dialogue, when we're trying to talk about one another, we can talk about things we disagree about. But on the whole, we're not trying to convince someone else that they're wrong. Just that we're trying to understand them and understand ourselves in that same dialogue as well.
Yeah, so that's kind of one of the problems with discourse at the moment is everyone's trying to prove themselves right and others wrong, whether it's politics, sports, whatever it may be, or certainly religion at the moment. I think in the mainstream, especially in the UK, you don't have a lot of religious talk anymore on TV channels. It used to be, was it the Big Questions used to come on BBC on Sunday mornings, and they used to have these kind of philosophical and theological debates, but I don't see that anymore. In the news, it's kind of absent, and in kind of current affairs programs, the kind of debate on religion is always kind of absent. But I think in the online community now, in the podcasting sphere and streaming sphere, I'm seeing a lot more content, yourself being one of those. So I think there is still a thirst or a yearning for it. I don't think we have become an irreligious society. I think the institutions have become irreligious, but I don't think people have. What's your experience of teaching? Is that something you see, or?
Yeah, I mean, if we look, for example, at the 2021 census, for the first time, Christianity as a religion people identified as fell below 50%. And I think the second largest answer to what is your religion is non-religious. But that doesn't mean that people don't believe in God. It just means that they don't belong to a religion. And so certainly in the conversations that I have, people are interested. Now, obviously, a lot of the conversations I have are religious, because people find out what I do for a living and they want to have a conversation about something, or if I go somewhere and I speak about religion, then they want to talk about that. So, but people do have that interest, and people are intrigued and want to understand both themselves and other people. I do think you're right. And there was, I think, Tony Blair's press officer, spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, he famously said, "We don't do God." And it's kind of the idea that we don't talk about God, we don't talk about religion. It's like, well, actually, that's really interesting, and it helps us understand people. If we take religion out of the conversation, then we begin to understand people less. I remember being asked a question when I was in university. I was doing a summer job, and someone said to me, "Well, if you weren't religious, you wouldn't do this." It's like, well, I don't know, because it's a part of who I am. I can't take off religious James and say, this is who I am, what I do, because it's an integral part of who I am. So having those conversations, I think people are intrigued and want to learn and want to understand. I think sometimes we do silo ourselves and we kind of just want to learn about people who are like us. But I think the greatest benefit comes from learning about people who are different, because we not only learn about them, but we also understand a little bit more about ourselves and why maybe I don't believe that, or maybe I don't think that, or maybe I don't do that. It's like, well, why don't I? And so it begins a period of self-reflection as well. I'm not sure I answered your question, but
No,
I do think you're quite right that kind of religion it does seem to have been sidelined a lot in the discussions in society, but I think in interpersonal discussions and things. I did some research a couple of years ago, did some interviews with religious leaders and religious believers, and they felt, for example, that government didn't understand religion either. So there were civil servants, there were people who were so this is in COVID, who were making laws and placing restrictions on people which were understandably needed, but they didn't consider the religious implications. They understood Church of England, they understood Catholic Church, they understood even perhaps Sunni Islam, but beyond that, there wasn't really an understanding of others. And so, for example, when you ban singing, and I kind of get that, but at the same time, singing kirtan is a central part of Sikh worship, but they hadn't considered that. It was kind of an unintended consequence that they were sidelining on earth. So I think as broad an understanding of religion and religions as possible, I think is really key in society, whatever job we do.
Is there a snobbery, do you think, in the kind of the institutional class around religions? Because if you look at the top echelons of all our, when you talk about the civil servants in government, or even at the corporate level as well, you see the same profile of people. Doesn't matter what background they're from. But theoretically, they've all gone to university. They're all at a middle-class lifestyle. I'm assuming they're not necessarily church or place of worship goers on a Sunday or a Saturday, whatever it may be. So they're all kind of of a mono-thought process, and it's all, well, what can we believe in science? What's the latest study says, and that's what we'll do. And the absence of religion is kind of, because it's at that political class level, and how society's been shaped by, we only pick these guys who've got 2-1 degrees from the red brick universities. Therefore, we're all churning out cookie cutter people who are all thinking the same. And if they're not considered a religion, therefore religion just kind of dilutes itself throughout society, or throughout organised, structured society anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably above my pay grade. I don't really know. But if I think about an experience I had, so, and this may happen. So when I was applying for my PGC, my teaching course, so I'd done my degree. And so I was applying, and I was being interviewed by actually the head of equal opportunities at the university and the history person. And on my CV, I spent 2 years as a missionary for my church. So it's obvious if you look at my CV, even before I studied religion, that I'm religious. And so the person who was asking me the question said, very negatively, how will your faith affect you in the classroom? So essentially, the question was, or the implication was, we know that you belong, I'm a Latter-day Saint or a Mormon, so we know that you are that. And you proselyte your religion, that's what you've done for 2 years of your life. Are you going to do that in the classroom? And I answered that question very badly, because I said, teaching James and Church James are two very different people. And so, and so as I began teaching, it was very clear that who I was as a religious person should really be sidelined, and I should just focus on the one thing. And I don't preach in the classroom. I don't talk about, I don't teach people about my religion. But what I do, and I've realized over the years, is I live my religion. I can't place it. But if I'm made to feel at the beginning of my career, I'm confident enough in myself not to feel this way anymore. But if I was made to feel at the very beginning of my career that my religion was something that perhaps needed to be glossed over slightly, then is there that same experience of people in government, in business, who feel the need, you know what, I maybe need to sideline my religion, I need to hide. And if we look over the years, so for example, post Second World War, there was quite a degree of immigration into the UK, and so South Asians especially, that's the community I've really studied. And so Sikhs would come over and they would cut their hair, and so they would try and assimilate, because and for example, Jews have done the same thing, and others have done the same thing. You try and assimilate and not be seen to stand out. Now, I think by the time we get to the second or third generation, people are much happier and much more confident in standing out. But I think in that first time, you don't want to put your head above the parapet and be the first person to do things. So I think you're right. It's kind of not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's kind of, you go into you go into an arena and you fit in rather than stand out. And I think that may have led to some sidelining of religion there, but I don't know for certain.
No, certainly not. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that you have actually gone outside the big six religions, or the main religions, and studying kind of the Dharmic faiths as well, so Sikhism, Buddhism, etc. What kind of fascinated you, kind of study those religions as much as kind of the Abrahamic religions?
So, a couple of things really. So, in terms of the big six, within Britain, they're Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Sikhism. I name them alphabetically so as not to offend anybody. So those are the six bigger religions. And so if I look at the Dharmic faiths of those, and those are the first three books, and first three kind of areas of research over the last few years, and then the ones I've written about most, I think it's because I wasn't as confident in those areas. So I was nominally brought up a Christian and then became a Christian in my teenage years. I lived and worked in an area that was that had a large Muslim population. And so I seemed to understand what would be termed the Abrahamic faith and kind of had a good knowledge. And so, although I had a working knowledge, because I taught them and because I'd had friends and I'd visited with people, I realized that my understanding wasn't the most amazing. So I began, for example, looking at Sikh as the first religion that I wanted to research, spend time with, talk about, write about. And it was just amazing because in some ways, as an outside observer, you imagine a religion is kind of all rosy and shiny and kind of everyone believes the same things. I know Christianity doesn't do that, and I know Islam doesn't do that. But I thought, okay, Sikhism, people tend to, and it's like, actually scratch the surface, and there's a whole range of diversity within it. And so, I mean, I knew that about Hinduism as well, because Hinduism, to an extent, is a Western construct. So it took all of these groups of people from the Indian subcontinent and shoved them together because they all looked and did similar things. But yes, so it was mainly inspired by the fact that not my ignorance, but my less understanding of them meant I wanted to study just a little bit more and learn about them in a way that I could speak confidently about the lived experience of Sikhs, of Buddhists, of Hindus today. And they were incredibly rich research opportunities for me in speaking with people from the different communities and exploring sacred texts and everything else. But at the same time, it was incredibly complicated, because the moment you think you'd pinned it down and think, okay, so this is what's believed, there's people who don't. And so I often, and this is what I say to my students, is when we talk just about anything about a religion, it's many, most, or some people believe this. You can't, I mean, probably within Islam, you could say all Muslims believe there's no God but Allah, Muhammad is his prophet. But then you get into the discussion about culturally Muslim as well, and it just gets a bit messy and diverse. So, yeah, that was, and then you asked about a question about religions outside of the big six. And so one of the concerns that I have, and this came out of my own religious experiences, so I believe I'm a Christian. I mentioned before, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but it's a small tradition. It's sometimes not very well viewed, and there's lots of stereotypes and misconceptions.
Lots of ridicule as well. So I was just saying, I mean, this is one of the things I thought that came to mind when I read your profile about you're a Mormon. Was obviously my only experience of Mormonism is watching the Book of Mormon, and the play, which is very offensive to Mormons, I would think, but I think as a church they took it quite well and kind of stood up to the ridicule, and sort of, from what I understand, are still growing strong as a faith.
Yes, I mean, it is great. I've never seen the Book of Mormon and won't. Because, as you say, I believe, well, it's full of profanity, but I seem to say some of my most. But so, in some ways, it's marginalized and it's not talked about, it's not represented. So, I began my career probably about 25 years ago. So, 5 years into my career, I began talking about it a bit and writing about it. And then over time, I realized that my experience as being, if you like, marginalized, and I recognize I'm a white man, so I'm not very marginalized. It's just in this one area. That wasn't just my experience. So if I'm a DDA, if I am a Jehovah's Witness, if I am whatever, the same experiences happen. And then you look beyond that and you look at, for example, Baha'i or Jain, Dharma, or you look at Rastafari and others. These are religions that are not spoken about. And it's because because they're smaller. So there's some terminology that says major and minor religions. And it's like, no, there's no such thing as a major religion. That's just our prejudice. So I can talk about big, small, majority, minorities, larger, smaller, whatever we want to talk about. But oftentimes small almost means not wrong, but it possibly means weird and everything else. Yeah. It's like, no, that's not. And so I wanted, and I realized that it wasn't just my own experience that mattered, but I wanted those with a smaller voice to actually have something to say. The seventh largest religion in the UK, according to the census, is paganism. And it was like, well, it's hardly ever taught about in schools. So why is that? Why do we take a religion, and whether it's a religion or not, that's a whole different question. Some people don't like the term religion applied to paganism, and it's pagans themselves. Yeah. But why is that not taught about? And it's like, okay, so we need to consider those questions, really. And I am one of the only ones that's banging on about it in this area. I think people are beginning to listen, but I don't know for certain.
Yeah, paganism is don't think I've ever come across anyone who's identified as a pagan, but then again, if you don't ask, you never know, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I don't mean I fiddled with the statistics, but if you look at the census data, so if in Christianity you put Baptist, Catholic, Mormon, Jehovah's Witnesses as your religion, you just got bunged into Christianity in the census. But in paganism, that didn't happen. If you put pagan, Wicca, Druid, witchcraft, and lots of others, you were treated separately. So individually, they all look quite small.
Right.
But if you put the umbrella tradition together, then actually, which is what happens with almost every other religion. It was interesting, this is a complete aside, is that Islam is monolithic within the census, except for the first time this year, or 2021, Alevi, which I would see as a tradition within Islam, was treated separately, and I don't know why. So, yeah, the census system is slightly, I don't know, inconsistent, shall we say.
Well, I think it's just, when nature of being a census, you're collecting data, and if you have every possible definition of everything, it would be so all-encompassing. You'd be
absolutely, yeah,
get rid of all the groups. So, just want to kind of, as we wrap up a little bit, what's kind of, obviously from a Sikh background myself, although not overly religious, but just studying your content, I've kind of learned things about Sikhism that I never knew or had misconceptions of. Is there anything that you think people have a misunderstanding about Sikhism in terms of what the common conception is, but the actual historical fact of the religious text doesn't quite support that viewpoint?
So I think there's two things, one that's positive and one that some people might see as negative. So the positive, and I've forgotten what they both were. Oh, so the positive one, I think, is, so in fact, I was having a conversation with my son about this the other week, and I was saying how in public perception, a Sikh or a Sikh man has a turban, a beard, everything else. And I said, well, if you look at the Sikh report, for example, I think it's about 18% of British Sikhs are Khalsa Sikhs, so who would fit that definition, male or female, obviously. Without the beard as a female. So you look at that and you think, well, actually, that means there's like 80% at least of Sikhs in Britain who do not wear the 5Ks, who do not do all of those things. And I think that's a stereotype that is taught within schools almost, that this is what a Sikh looks like. And my son said, well, I've never seen a Sikh without a turban. It's like, well, how would you know? You wouldn't know if you had seen one. And so I think just the idea that there is a rich diversity within Sikhism, I think, is really key for us to understand. And for example, the same report suggests that, for example, 80% of Sikhs say daily prayers. It's like, well, actually, that's a greater indicator of spirituality. And there was a book that came out last year called Both Not Half. I think it's Jasa Alawaliya, and he's Punjabi. He's a white one, half. Well, he's both. He's not half. He's half English, half Punjabi.
Yeah.
And so he goes on that. And his spirituality is very different, but he identifies as Sikh. And it's just the richness and the diversity that is within Sikh is just, I think, really positive, and I think helps us understand lots more. The negative one actually begins positively, because one of the things that I absolutely love about Sikh is the teachings of the gurus, especially Guru Nanak, on equality. Mm-hmm. And how when Guru Nanak taught, there was no caste, no gender discrimination, everyone was equal. And for the time that he lived, and even today, it's a radical equality that is just, oh my goodness, I wish was prevalent within society, and people recognized and sees, and Gurnella talked about seeing Waheguru, seeing the divine within everybody. And I think that is probably one of the things that I look at Sikhi as well as Seva, as kind of what's known as holy envy. I think those are two wonderful beliefs that or practices that I just try and emulate somewhat. But in my studies of Sikhi, I realized that actually that's the ideal. And although I recognized this within Christianity and other religious traditions, that sometimes the ideal is not lived up to, I don't know why that was such a surprise. So, for example, one of my local Gurdwaras has been identified to me as a Jat Gurdwara. And it's like, hang about that. That doesn't compute. That really. So if there is no such thing as caste, then how is there a Jat Gurdwara, and how does that work? So I think that surprised me about the Sikh community, and I think that's, I don't know. But that happens. It's not just Sikhs that do that. It's everybody that does that, isn't it? But I think there's those two things. So there's positives and negatives, and just recognizing the richness and the diversity, I think, is what both attracts me to studying and learning and understanding Sikhism more. Is it's just this, and actually, I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, but Sikhs are probably, as a group, as I think about all of the Sikhs that I know, just the nicest people, just the most generous people. And so it's like, and there will be exceptions, don't get me wrong, but of all the people that I've spoken to, they're just incredibly generous with their time, with everything that they do. Just one of my favorite people, I mentioned him before, a man called Sutbir. He runs charities. He just doesn't think about himself. He retired and just took the opportunity to. There's a charity in Manchester called Feed My City, and it's just like, oh my goodness! And it's inspired by Langer. It's inspired by his. And it's just like, yes, those are the types of things that I just love. Anyway, I could talk about Sikhish forever in a day because there's just so many wonderful things that are going on within it.
Yeah, I do have a question about Sikhi that I haven't had answered yet, but we'll save it for another podcast. So probably going to a long, deep and meaningful one. So I think we'll probably wrap it up if you don't mind. Just one of closing thoughts. I know we started off talking about religion in society. How do you think religious studies and religion in the wider society, how do you think that's going to pan out over the next couple of generations? Are people going to go back to a more traditional view of religion and encompassing society, or are we on a different path, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, religious studies itself, I think there's lots of positivity because people are wanting to understand others, and religion is a big part of things. And I think in some ways, there has tended to be people who have not found answers within the world, whatever the world means. And so therefore are looking back to those places such as religions that provided those answers. But I think religions are evolving as well. Now, whether that's a positive or a negative thing, I don't mind. In an episode of Futurama, there was a consolidated church, and it had all the different religious symbols where all of the religions became one. That's never going to happen. And I'm not sure it should. But I think people are having to understand their place in the world much more and actually take account. So if I lived in the 15th century as a Christian, I didn't have to think about anybody else. I didn't have to think about Muslims or Hindus and how God loves them. But I now have to consider those questions in the 21st century and before as well. So I think as we encounter new things, I think religions are adapting and they are developing. And I think religions can provide those. Now, one of the problems some people see with society is that almost it's a permissive society where anything goes. And I think religions sometimes give structure and enable people to find kind of a way of living that is prescribed. And I think there's lots of people who like that. And so kind of the things are decided for them and they know the parameters within which they live. So I think there's lots of appeal for religions. And I think, I mean, Nietzsche said God is dead, didn't he? And kind of it's kind of the idea that religion has had its day. And I think the opposite is true, that religion has come out of the other side of whatever postmodernism was and flourishes and is growing. I think it is more acceptable to be non-religious than it ever was today. So I think there is more diversity in that way. But I do think that religions perhaps are, I would say taken more seriously. So I think if someone is religious, they've actually thought about that and made that decision rather than it just being an inherited part of their identity. So I think there's lots of positive things that will happen, and I think it will continue to flourish. But I don't know. Watch this space. We'll have a conversation in 20 years' time. Hopefully we'll still be around and see how it's done.
Certainly. Thank you much for your time there, Dr. Holt. If people wanted to kind of follow your stuff more closely, I know you've got a TikTok channel. Is there anywhere else? Obviously, you said you're publishing a book on Judaism soon. Where's the best place to follow your work?
So, yes. So there's TikTok and Instagram, both have the same handle. So it's at Dr. James D. Holt. And then I also have a website, which is jamesdholt.com, where I post news and everything else that kind of goes on. So yeah, those are probably, I think, there's also a Facebook, which is Dr. James D. Holt as well, to separate it from my personal account. It's just the easiest way of doing it. So yeah, a book. I'm always happy to talk to people and answer questions if people want to chuck anything at me.
Fantastic. Well, we'll link to all your external socials on the episode description. But Dr. James Holt, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to doing this again.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion.